Hi there. Do you know how each of the different scopes works and how you can use them to analyze, balance and grade your footage? In this guide, I'll show you how to read and understand the scopes and how you can use them to set your white balance, to check your exposure levels, to control your saturation and even make sure you get perfect skin tone. Scopes are extremely useful and you might have a non-calibrated monitor or your eyes have adapted to a color cast, but you can always trust your scopes. So start using them to their full potential. So follow along in this guide and you'll have very solid knowledge on how to use your scopes, and I'll finish off with some nice tips and tricks about the scopes. Okay, so let's first do an overview of the scopes. So if you don't have scopes enabled in the color page, if you're on the keyframes here, you can click on the scopes icon and that will show you the scopes. Now you can also expand the window with the little expand button here and you get a larger window. That makes it a little more easy to see what's happening on the scopes. Up here on top you have an option to see single view, a 2-up, 4-up and a 9-up. So if that's not working for you, you might need to expand the window and make it a little bit bigger, and then you have the 2-up, the 4-up and the 9-up. So let's just go back to the 1-up, and if you go under the drop-down menu here, you can see you have your 5 different scopes. That comes with Davinci. You have your Parade, you have your Waveform, you have your Vector Scope, you have your Histogram, and you have your CIE Chromaticity Scope. So let's go back to the Parade here, and at the top right here you have the optional menu, and this is where you can set various settings. Below you have a settings menu that's unique to each different scope, and we'll also come back to that later. So that's just a quick overview of the scopes. The great thing about having this expand option is you can then move that to a second monitor, and you can even save that as a workspace layout preset, and then you have all your scopes on a dedicated monitor, which is going to make it a lot easier to get a good overview of your footage. So the first scope we're going to look at is Waveform. So Waveform represents the Y luminance or the brightness in your image, and from left to right you have your pixels in your image, and from top to bottom you have your luminance, where you have the brightest pixels at the top and your darkest pixels, your blacks, at the very bottom. So by default it measures the internal state of the image data in this numeric scale from 0 to 1023 in 10-bit, regardless of whether you set your data levels to video or to data, but we're going to come back to that later. If you're working on an HDR grade, you can go to the optional menu here, and under the waveform scale style you can choose HDR ST2084, and that will just replace your scale with a nit value scale going from 0 to 10,000. Now this is a studio only feature, so it won't be available for you if you are on the free version. It's important to notice here that if you're working on a non-Davinci color managed workflow and you activate the HDR scale type up here, the waveform will always represent the HDR levels, even if you manually selected the output color space as Rec 709. So it won't be 100% accurate, but I'm guessing if you're grading HDR, you're probably already aware of that. But by default, it'll be set to 10-bit like so. Other options you have under the waveform scale style is 12-bit. You have a percentage value that you can measure your scopes in. You have a millivolts, and then finally you have the HDR. All right, moving on to Parade. So in the drop down, we're going to select Parade scopes. And just like in the waveform, you have your pixels from left to right and your brightness from bottom to the top. But here you see the Parade scope shows the separate waveforms side by side. So you can easily analyze the strength of each of the individual RGB signals. You read them exactly like the waveform, and you can use this. It's very efficient to see if you have a color cast or if you have issues with your white balance. Very useful if you want to create a look, like if you want to push some warmth into your highlights and maybe some blues into your shadows. This is a very good scope to see that in. And also worth to notice here, just like in the waveform scope, the distance between the pixels at the bottom and at the top, that actually represents your contrast ratio. So if it's very squished, like if you get a log footage, you will see a very short distance between the top and the bottom. And if you have a good contrast, like in this image you can see up here, then you'll have a wider distance between the top and the bottom. That's just going to tell you, okay, you have a good, healthy contrast amount. When the RGB channels are aligned, like you can see here, you have your red level here, and you have your green level, and you have the blue level. When they're exactly aligned, then you know you have perfectly balanced footage, and you can start to work out from there. So that's a good thing to know when you're doing your primary grades. You want to align those, and sometimes it's easier to see that on the waveform, because when they're aligned, you'll see the colors disappears, the red, green, and blues, and all the saturation in the scope disappears, and you get pure white, and that means it's 100% white balanced. The vector scope measures the overall range of the hues and the saturation within your image. The colors here on the outside that you can see indicates, or the markers here indicate the colors. So you have your magentas, you have your blues, your cyan, your green, your yellow, and your reds, which perfectly corresponds to your color wheels. And at the center you have 0% saturation, so that is either pure white or pure black. You have 0 saturation in here. You also have a skin tone indicator, so if you go to the settings menu, you can select the skin tone, like so. And if you want to see them a little more clearly, you can actually also choose 2x zoom, and you get a little better view of what's going on. Just be aware that you're now expanding the whole scope, so it's not a one-to-one representation of your image, but it makes it quite easy to see what's going on. This scope is very, very useful for balancing. So if I select my offset down here, and you can see, let's say the image was with a green color cast like so, and you want to bring the bulk of your scope, your data in here, you just take your offset and you take a look at the scopes, and it's very, very easy to see when you get a good white balancing of the image. So you can bring it in towards the center. So great tool for balancing, great tool to use in your primary corrections, and great tool to see if you have a tint in your image, because if you have, you'll see that everything is kind of like skewed away from the center. So very useful tool. So another thing about the vector scope is that under the optional menu you have, and this is for the vector scope only, you have vector scale styles. It'll be set to standard by default. The standard is showing the center, and you have boxes out here to indicate your primary and secondary use. And the outer circle you see out here is a general reference for the angle that any part of the graph might fall along. So this will be default, but you can also turn everything off by going up here, turning it off, and you won't have any graticule like so. Then you also have a simplified version. It shows crosshairs for the center in here, and you have smaller crosshairs on the outside to indicate each of the primary and secondary use. Apart from that, we have this is really cool, the hue vectors style. This is designed to make it more useful for colorists, or more easy for them to have references in the process where you're trying to create looks and comparing images. The graticule lines here are a pretty useful reference if you want to like have color separation and you want to compare the different hues and saturations. So they are aligned with the red and cyan, with the yellow and blue, and with the magenta and green axis. So it's a pretty easy way to indicate the natural warm or cool axes in your image. And you can see out here you have a tick mark, and that represents a 100% level of saturation. You also have an option, if you go into the style, here to set it to 75, or you can have both the 100 and the 75 like so, and then you get this nice looking scope. But by default that will be off and it will be set to standard. Let's move on to the histogram. So this displays an analysis of how many pixels of each color channel lie at a certain percentage of tonality along a scale that goes from 0, which is the dark, and to 100, which is the whitest white. The red, green and blue channel shows the number of pixels that each of those channels have in the image, and this is also very helpful for color balancing, just like the waveforms in the parade. And the difference in the width again, let me just bring that back. The difference in the width again will indicate the contrast ratio in your image. So again, we have darks and we have almost up to 80% of white, so we have good spread of contrast in the image. Just by looking at the scopes we can see that. And the last of the scopes you have here in Davinci is the CIE chromaticity scopes, and probably the least used of the scopes, but it can be very helpful because it lets you see the current image as a graph against a triangle that represents the value of the color gamut that you're working within, along with an indication of the current white point, which you see right here. And the label shows the current gamut. And you have an option if you go down here in the settings menu, you can show an additional gamut. So let's say we want to see the Davinci white gamut. There we go. That's the big gamut, and you can see how big that is compared to the others. That's why we often prefer to color grade in Davinci white gamut. Just be aware that this is a 2D visualization of a 3D space. So it won't be a 100% accurate representation, but it will give you a rough estimate of how you're working, how your footage looks within that color space. Now let's go back to the parade here and the optional menu. I promised to tell you a little bit about the data level scopes. So by default, your scopes will be set to show your data levels of your image. But if you have a project where it's required that you measure everything in video levels, you can set it to that, and you will see your scale out here changes. This option only affects how your scopes are displayed. So it has absolutely no effect on your image or at your output. This is only how you read the scopes, but if you don't have a requirement to show everything in video levels, you just leave it at the default at data levels and you'll be good to go. Now another thing to talk about here in the optional menu is the ratio. If that fits better to your screen, you can change it from 16:9 to 4:3. And also you have a quality setting. By default it will be set to medium. And if you take a look at the scopes, I can just try to make them a little bit bigger here. And then if you go to the quality setting, if you go to high, you'll get a better quality scope that uses a little bit more performance on your machine. So if you're having issues with the performance on your machine, you can either go to auto and let Davinci figure it out for you, or you can set it to low. But if you're on a fairly good machine, I recommend you can set it to high and you get a better representation on the scopes. Another thing you have up here is the option to set a low pass filter. So if you select that and take a look at the scopes. So what this does is it filters out the signal noise to make the scopes more clear to read. Just note that it can make the highlights and the shadows on the graph seem a little bit shy of where they actually are. So it's recommended that if you do that you go down and you have to go to your settings here and you use extents. So extents draws an outline highlighting the excursions to show you the true level of overshots and undershots in your video. So that's an option you have as well. I usually leave this on, so turn extents off and turn the low pass filter off, like so, and back to the default. Like I promised you some tips and tricks. So if you have a mouse with a middle scroll wheel, you can see it's already moving. You can use the middle scroll wheel to pan around your image. And if you have the Alt key pressed, you can even zoom in to your scopes if you really need to get down to something nitty-gritty. And if you want to get back, you can always go to the settings menu and reset the view. Pretty useful. Already talked about the 2 up, the 4 up, and the 9 up. So that's also a very, very handy feature to have. And this is in the parade scopes only. If you go to your settings menu, you have an option to select either RGB, which is the default, or you can select YRGB, you'll get the luminance channel, or you can get the YCBCR version of the scopes if you need that. Extents we already talked about, and then you have your parade slider, like so, that brightens or dims your scopes, and the graticule that brightens or dims your graticules, so you can set it up exactly like you want. And down here you also have reference levels. So you can adjust the lows. So you can see down here, it might be a little bit hard to see, but you can see this line here. I can push it up and down. So maybe you get a reference before you start color grading that maybe the DP don't want the lows to go less than a certain amount. So you can set a reference level and you can use that in your grading process to easily see if you overshoot or undershoot that. So I'm gonna reset that. And then if we go to the waveform, another cool feature here, if we go down here, you can select the RGB and you can select the individual channels. By default, they'll all be turned on. But if you want to select the blue channel only, you can do that, or the blue and the red channel, or you can overlay everything. But that's a very cool way, an easy way to kind of like view each channel. If you have an issue, if you really want to see your reds and you want to focus on them, then you can do that. And for the vector scopes, that's cool as well. If we go to the vector scope, and if you go to the settings, you can choose to see the lows of the image, the mids, or the highlights only. So a cool way to use that is if you have set up a multiple scopes like so. Let's actually go to a 9 up and let's make this a little bit bigger so you can see it better. So we're gonna have something else here. So on the top left, you can select, maybe you want here, you only have the lows. And the middle, you can select to have the mids. And then on the right hand side, you have the highs. And then here at the bottom, you have everything. So now you have everything split up. So it's very easy for you to get an overview. If you want to select work only on the mids, it's very easy for you to see how that responds. And then you have the full scope down here, and you can make that bigger by turning that maybe into a 2x zoom or whatever you need. And again, you have a skin tone indicator here. So let's go back to 1 scope up here and let's turn on the skin tone indicator. Really useful tool if you want to measure how your skin is setting. So you can select the qualifier down here, and if you go to your settings and if you have your skin tone indicator set, and if you go to the top here and activate display qualifier focus, the qualifier focus will show you on the scopes where your mouse is at. So if you measure her skin tones here, you can see it's right on the skin tone indicator line, and you can see the same for him here, it's the same. So very cool way. Before, people used to maybe make a power window, make a circle around the forehead, and then only highlight that and then check how that looked in the scope. But much faster to go to your settings menu here, activate display qualifier focus, make sure you have the qualifier activated, and then you just hover over the skin. Quick and easy way to fine tune and adjust your skin. Okay, so that's it. I hope you like this walkthrough. I hope it made you a little more comfortable using the scopes. If you liked it, please consider subscribing, maybe giving us a like. We really appreciate that. That really helps us get out there and make more videos for all of you. So catch you on the next one.